Hi, this is Tasha Bergson-Michelson from Google, and we are going to go ahead and get started. With me today as a panelist, I have Kimberly Johnson, who's part of our user experience team, and she is going to be answering questions in chat. So if you have any questions, please share them with all panelists, and then you will be able to, she'll be able to answer your questions. And if you can find chat in the bottom lower right-hand corner of your screen. You should see a small box with a bunch of icons. One of them should look like a little talking bubble, like you see in a cartoon, and that is where you would find chat. And by the way, oops, hold on. By the way, this is me. Sorry for the picture, but some of you have said that it's that you don't know who's talking to you, and since I can't show you myself in video, we're going to move on from that. That's what I look like. I was thinking about search, as I usually am. I am part of the search education team here at Google, and Kimberly participates in the team as well. When she's not working on teaching search, she is working on user experience. So I really thank her for joining us today. So let's see. I want to talk about what we're going to cover today. So we're going to go through several steps. You know, as academics in a university setting, you already have a lot of training in authority and what authority looks like in your field. So I spent a long time thinking about what would be the most useful to share with you today. So I thought, first of all, I'd share with you what I hear from students and teachers and librarians in the K-12 setting about what they think about when it comes to credibility and authority and evaluation and what they're taught, what they're talking with students about. We'll take a moment to look at the differences among a bunch of these kind of terms, because generally, as a librarian, we talk about web evaluation, which is a big catch-all for all of these different pieces of understanding what sources we should use. My team thinks a lot about credibility, what credibility is and the role it plays in search. Of course, it's really interesting because being part of a consumer-based search tool where we're literally serving many, many types of people around the world, billions of people, there's really a question of credibility for whom. And so what we do when we deliver results might be slightly different from how you want to manage, we provide tools and special ways to help you manage your search to find information that's credible to you when it's appropriate for you to be thinking in terms of your own sense of credibility. We'll get to that in a moment. And then, as you can see, we'll talk about kind of on-the-go assessment and tools for exploring authority more deeply. So, to get started. Oh, one more thing. There's a big disclaimer here. I may talk about websites. I might show you particular websites. I may talk about ideas. For those of you who went through the little exercises that we usually share when we do this class in person, you have already seen that we're comparing different attitudes towards different ideas. We're not saying that one thing is good and one thing is bad. We're simply saying these are ideas or websites which stimulate conversation about credibility and authority. So what are students taught? A lot of students who come to you, if they've been taught at all about website evaluation, have been taught in the context of hoax sites. Now, hoax sites are awfully fun. They truly are. And I have been known to use one or two in the course of my classes in time, and in fact, I'll talk about that as we go forward. The difficulty is, of course, that it's one thing to do a search. Actually, let's take a look. It's one thing to do a search for let's say a tree octopus. Hold on one second. It's one thing to search for a tree octopus here. And when you do a search for tree octopus, you can see here just in the snippet for the Wikipedia entry, you can already see that it's labeled a hoax. It's another thing entirely when you find yourself looking at a source and it's not so much a hoax, but it's biased information or misinformation or old information. That's much harder. And so it's very difficult for students sometimes to make that leap from sorry, just a moment. It's very hard to make that leap from hoax to kind of the real and deep types of evaluation students need to be making on a daily basis. So what are students told in high school at an educational level? You know, they are hearing things like only use good sources, but they're not told what a good source is. Of course, there's a lot of conversation about Wikipedia and whether it should be used. There's a lot of mistrust coming from educators towards students about how they're going to interact, and a lot of mistrust towards the internet writ large. And so students hear a lot of kind of negativity about around this. They hear a lot of negativity around this issue, but in point of fact, they actually have a very different experience in their daily lives. That is to say that they will hear a teacher say, for example, don't use Wikipedia, but everyone around them is using it and having very positive results. Or they hear don't use Wikipedia and they go home and they ask their parents a question and the parents use Wikipedia to answer it, or the teacher says don't use Wikipedia and they ask the teacher a question and they see the teacher using Wikipedia. So it can be very conflicting, and students see that the things that make sense and that people are doing in their daily lives don't necessarily match what they're being told about evaluation. So we're going to look at that a little more deeply in a moment. First, there are a lot of words that we'll kind of throw around in the course of today, and to give them some coherence, here's what we're talking about. So credibility is how much you personally find something believable. Does it match your belief system? Does it resonate well with how you think about the world? Authority is something we think about a lot more kind of in an academic context, for example. You know, we have kind of a canon of how we think about what is scholarly and how we define that. And in a lot of cases, in an academic setting, we want authority to trump credibility in the work that students are doing. That's a challenge for students. Of course, is a page informative? This is something, or a source, this is something that students have a much kind of easier time with because they're like, oh, this is great, it has lots of information I need. That resonates and is simple. What's much, much harder in my experience for students is what's useful. What I hear from so many K-12 instructors, and you can talk about this at a university level, is that students really don't necessarily, they have a lot of trouble today matching whether something is useful to their actual needs. That is, they can see that the words they were looking for are there in the document, but that doesn't necessarily help them understand if it matches what they're actually trying to achieve. So something for those of you who are in K-12 education or going into K-12 education need to think about is how to help your students make those determinations when they're looking at a source. Very quickly, because something that comes up when we talk about the internet and information is spam. So what exactly is spam when we're talking about it? Well, you can see there's a definition here, and spam plays out in a lot of ways. For example, sometimes websites have text on them that's hidden so you can't see the text, but it actually will match your search results. Cloaking is when you go to a website, when you click on a link, you've looked, for example, you've done a search or even read an introduction to a web page on your in another page you're looking at, and when you click on the link, it takes you someplace you don't expect. For example, once I was doing a search challenge on Kermit the Frog, and I was trying to find a bit of video where he was wearing a graduation cap and gown and find out what he was saying. And I saw a snippet that looked like an exact match, and I clicked on it, and there was no Kermit the Frog, but there was, in fact, a little scroll bar that says your computer may be infected with spyware, and it was downloading onto my computer. So clearly I got out of there quickly. That's an example of a cloaked site. You may also remember, especially back in the day when there was so much web spam, when people used to put entire dictionaries, all the words in the dictionary on their web page, white text on white background, so that whatever you searched for, it would come up. And then, of course, there are these pages, these content farms, which just have links after links after links after links, and they may be related or unrelated, but they aren't getting you anywhere. These are all examples of spam, and they're all things that we at Google are striving to get out of your search results, but it's important to recognize them when you see them. Another quick thing to look out for, and this I would show you live, but we're going to stick here so we don't risk the computer. When we believe that there is a site that is going to have malware, or the spyware I was just talking about, or we think maybe the site's been hacked, we will show you that in your results. So up at the top here, you can see an example of a site or of an interstitial page. That is, you may click on a link, and this may pop up instead, warning you that the site we think potentially has bad content that will harm your computer. You may also see when you do a search here that we think that a site has been hacked. If you look at this, the Perth street bikes, you wouldn't really anticipate that it would be about Viagra, which is what the snippet, the words in context you see in the search result is saying. And that's, and so we tell you with this link in between the title and the snippet that there's a chance that you're in negative territory that you want to leave behind. So, what is credibility? This is, as you think about the background information we just covered, we move into a question of, okay, so I want to avoid spam, I want to avoid malware. Those are clearly negative. But then there's the question of, when I'm looking at a source, how do I judge if I find it believable or not? Because that's really the first thing that we all respond to. And actually, I want to look back for a second. Again, for those of you who took some of the worksheets that I passed out, this is a task that we give out at the beginning of our in-person credibility workshops. And it's really, we've taken a couple of controversial or difficult issues, fairly lightweight ones, they're not really academic, but we put, in many cases, 2 pages side by side. For example, with the GMOs, we send you to one page that is from a trade journal in biosciences, and the other is an article about how GMOs are dangerous. And in comparing the two, what we really want to bring to top of mind is how you personally feel when you look at these sites. Because, truth be told, as deep as we may want to get with our analysis of what is a good quality source, a lot of the times our response is really judged by more viscerally. And what I want to say that I really appreciate the folks of you who undertook this is I think that you did a very honest job at going through these tasks. One of the things we see and that you should be aware of when you work with students is when we're talking about research skills, people tend to ramp it up in a classroom setting, right? So a lot of times people will go through all these steps to see whether they think that that MayoClinic.com is really part of the Mayo Clinic. And we ask, in real life, would you actually go through those steps before taking the information on ankle injury from MayoClinic.com? And a little shamefacedly, they say, no, I wouldn't, but I'm in a class, so I thought it was important to do. So something to keep in mind is, as we talk about more and more complicated steps, they aren't feasible for everyday interactions with the web. And so we're going to be focusing a lot on kind of feasible strategies. So here we have some rules of thumb about credibility. And I'm actually going to share with you our longer slide set at the end of this for our 2.5-hour class. You can go through and look at these step by step, what we have to say about them. But as a basic idea, credibility is socially constructed. As I said, whether you believe a Fox news report that BPA's additives in plastic are perfectly safe, or a Huffington Post posting by Dianne Feinstein that says they're dangerous and should be banned from the marketplace, is really a matter of who you are and what you believe. And that's carried out by the fact that when we do this workshop in certain parts of California, when we do this workshop, generally everyone in the room agrees which of those sources is credible. But when we're in certain counties in California, the Fox News story is the credible one, and when we're in other counties in California, it's the Huffington Post Dianne Feinstein. And so we take that again. Credibility is socially constructed. Credibility is not actually truth. It's not the same thing. A great example of this is, of course, that Christopher Columbus thought the world was flat. I don't know about you, but that's what I was taught in school. That was that he didn't think the world was flat, and he went out to disprove that. And that was pure fact when I was a child. Now there's much more discussion that that was a historiographic, that if you look at historiography, you see that that was a construct of historians with a particular agenda, and it is no longer fact. So truth changes as well. My needs matter. For example, let's say, this is another example of truth changing. Another thing that I was taught when I was growing up was that Tyrannosaurus rex was a huge predator, and now that's a source of great debate. When you look too at your needs change what's credible. So, for example, when I am looking at Josh Beckett and I'm trying to decide, is he a good baseball player? One part of me, if I want to know, is he a good baseball player from a personal point of view, I can look at this blog. Now, blogs are often raged against as not being a very good source of information. But here, Curt Schilling is a former professional baseball player. He knows other baseball players personally. So he can write with a personal authority about the personality of Josh Beckett. But of course, if what you want to know, if your determination of is he a good player has to do with his statistics, then you're really going to want something like the Major League Baseball site, because that's going to give you a very different type of authority and a very different type of view of whether he's a good player or not. So another thing we know is that aesthetics matter. And I'm actually going to pull here an example that we looked at in the opening exercises that I emailed out. So when we show a page of this nature to a room full of educators, their response is, oh, black background, yellow font. Immediately, I know that's not a credible site, because no credible site is a black background and yellow font. Well, let me tell you that there are plenty of sites out there that are a white background and absolutely gorgeous and are still terrible quality. And the other important thing to note is for any of you who are working with third graders, this is just about as credible as it gets. All it's missing is a couple of bouncing penguins. But to a third grader, a black background and yellow text is much more compelling than a boring old white background with nice black font on it. So so that is also based on perception. But aesthetic you'll actually see checklists that say that the aesthetics of a site matter towards its credibility. But if you look at websites, for example, that are turned out in the academic world, you'll see often that highly scholarly websites are not necessarily the most attractive things out there. And there, as I said, there are beautiful websites that are based on bad science. Wikipedia is not wicked. We're going to return to that one later, but it's based on the idea that there are a lot of types of sources that get a bad rap, and that we really can't, that we really shouldn't judge. There are great ways to blend them in to our working life. There's a continuum of truth. So somewhere between fact and opinion, sorry, I'm looking for, here we go. Somewhere between fact and opinion lies how we talk about fact. I actually pulled this particular image, which is fabulous. We use it in our longer credibility slideshow that I'm going to share with you later. And we use it to demonstrate the work that's taking place on Wikipedia. What you're seeing here is results of a study where someone looked at how much time people are spending on which tasks in Wikipedia. Well, here's what's really interesting about it to me, is if you look at the vertical axis, you'll see that it doesn't actually start at 0 per se. And so even though this information might be true based on the study that the authors carried out, when I look at it, I'm getting a somewhat skewed immediate picture. And of course, the same thing happens when we take quotes out of context and so forth. And finally, I can believe multiple things at once. So Dan Russell has some my team leader has some interesting stories about this, varying from visiting his mother and having her say in one sentence something about Barack Obama's pastor and the fact that he's Muslim, to someone he met in a user study who was having neck problems, and she was of a Chinese background, and her Chinese doctor told her it needed heat, and her Western doctor told her it needed ice or something like that. And so her solution was to alternate, heating, icing, heating, icing, heating, icing. So there are many ways that we take apparently conflicting views and incorporate them. One I see all the time with kids is that they believe that they simultaneously believe that everything on the web is true, and they believe that everything's an ad. And they're happy to defend and speak with great passion about both of those and don't see the inherent contradiction. So you can create your own truth. You bring together information and decide what you're going to believe. And there's some things you can take on faith. Because one thing I think when we talk about evaluation with students is that they really they start to get desperate. And if you start talking about the fact that you can't trust what's on the web, they start feeling like they have to check absolutely everything. And really, there are some things we just have to believe. So at a certain point, you have to draw a line in the sand, and you have to give your students permission to draw a line in the sand and determine that at a certain point, they're just going to go with it. So the real takeaway from all of these ideas is that what I want to see in my students is that when they engage in a research project, that they take a little while to think critically about what their own biases are and what makes them view something as credible. And then they have to think about the task that they're actually undertaking and decide how much that matters. Because, you know, if they're working on an issues paper, as some universities, like especially first-year writing courses, have students do, then perhaps, possibly, depending on how the assignment is put together, bias is okay. And there are other times when the research you're doing, it's truly okay for you to base your research on your point of view and what you think is credible. And then there are other times where that's not okay, right? I mean, what we want, again, in academia is we hope that students will get practice taking off their credibility, their view of credibility, and putting on the mantle of the academy and really attending to scholarly authority. And we want them to have that experience so that when they go out in the world, when they need to do that, they have that ability, right? Not only for if they do scholarly work, but if, for example, they have a health situation with a family member, heaven forbid, or they have to make decisions for work, we want them to be able to take a broader view and make and understand what is considered authoritative in the area they're looking at, and have the opportunity to make good choices. So how do we do that? Really? That's the question. I mean, in a while, we'll talk about tools that you can use for really digging down into websites and seeing what matters. But first is a question of how do we give them tools that they can really functionally apply every day in all their searching. Actually, it occurs to me I should stop and ask if you do have any questions. I'm going to give you a minute. If you have any questions, feel free to put them in chat. But I think we're just about to get started on the strategy section. Okay, so let's go ahead. If anything shows up, I will address it. So I wanted to talk to you about some of the things that I talk to students about myself that are easier to kind of integrate into one's everyday activities. Oh, sorry, I do see a question coming up, and thank you, Kimberly, for answering it. So WRT is with respect to. And by the way, I will share this deck with you later, so you'll have it on hand. So before I came to Google, I actually wrote an article for the American Association of School Libraries trade magazine called Knowledge Quest that was called Predict Before You Click. And it was about students and reading search results. Because I believed at the time, and I've come to believe increasingly, that the really critical thing, if we could teach one skill to students that would get the farthest towards curing all ills, it's to actually observe their search results. So when I do a search, I don't actually first look at the top link and then the second link and then the third link. I actually first look at my screen. And I don't know, I've actually been trying to remember when I started doing that and how I started doing that. But it's just a different way of approaching the results page. Because when I look at a page of results, I'm asking myself several questions simultaneously. I'm wondering, is there a problem with my query? And is there a problem with the question that I think I'm asking? And only after I assess that, which at this point I do in most times a blink of an eye, really, then do I ask, are there any good links? So I took this example, which I actually talk about in the article. It came from an elementary school student, but I think it applies to us all. So as you may know, animal breeds are very controversial. If you want to know how many breeds of almost any kind of animal there are, you come up with highly varying answers. So this is what happens. A student runs a search like this, and what you see, if you look at the top result, it says there are 43 different breeds of cats. And if you look at the bottom result, it says there's 77 different breeds of cats. And in fact, the student in question, when she originally did this search, didn't have any results that had numbers in them. So they were more like the third result, the breeds of cats with pictures, and the fourth result, different breeds of cats with photos, etc. And she actually clicked through and was counting the links. Like she would click on a page and 1, 2, 3. Here, let's go over actually and look at the actual results here. So she was actually going through. Oops, I missed the top link. Look at that, or it changed order when I did the search. But she was actually clicking through and counting the links on each of these pages. And of course, they didn't come up with the same number, or maybe she miscounted. And she was absolutely and utterly devastated and in tears, and didn't know what to do. When I look at these responses, I see immediately that there's conflicting information, because here we have the 43 and here we have the 77, and I'm noticing too that I'm looking at the URLs, and it's not that these are necessarily bad sites, but just looking at these web addresses, catchannel.com and caturine.net and so forth, I'm thinking that these are all created for a very good purpose for hobbyists, but if I want more authoritative information, I just don't feel like I'm getting it. And I'm getting that sense by comparing across the links I see on the screen. And in point of fact, I begin to feel a little frustrated. And part of what I'm thinking is, you know, maybe I didn't run the right search, because it's not bringing up for me information that seems to be what I want. But even more, this very first link, which is Wikipedia, tells me that there's a list that includes established breeds recognized by various cat registries. Now, this is really interesting to me. One thing it tells me is I may actually want to click on this link and look at it, because it may have some information that I need. But what it tells me even more is two things. One, that somebody out there is thinking critically about breeds of cats. And I want to know who those people are, and those are the people who I want to tell me what kinds of breeds of cats there are. The other thing it's telling me is that basically maybe there's a question that comes before how many breeds of cats there are, and that question is, how is a breed determined? How is a breed defined? And who is in charge of that definition? So once I've looked at these results, I realize that there are other steps I need to be taking. And in fact, as I recall, if I change my search to recognized breeds of cats, then I get much better results. And in fact, had I gone to the Wikipedia page, I would have seen that there's the Cat Fanciers Association and the Traditional Cats Association are some of the registries that really think about this. Now, these still aren't scholarly. This example comes from a fourth grader, but you can extrapolate out and think how it applies in a more scholarly setting. It's also really important to look for clues in your page. This is another student who is doing research on Emperor Norton, and she wanted to know if you haven't read about Emperor Norton, Emperor of these United States and Protector of Mexico. He's an excellent figure in San Francisco history, declared himself emperor and told President Lincoln, "Thank you very much for your time, I've got it now." And she wanted to know, well, if he was poor before he became emperor, as he was, after he was emperor and he printed all his own money and everything, was he poor when he died? And so she started doing some research into this, and she found a lot of mentions of him having $2 in silver and $3, or $2 in gold and $3 in silver when he died. So she ran this search, and she looked at the results, and she thought, first of all, she looked at the web addresses, and she wasn't terribly happy with them. She didn't think that they looked authoritative. And it's really interesting. One thing I found is that students are much more receptive than I would have thought to parsing URLs, because web addresses are relatively simple in their construction and their vocabulary, and they're more accessible to students, perhaps, than looking at an entire source and trying to figure it out. But one of the interesting things she noticed that I thought was fascinating was she noticed that there was one place in all her results where there was a quotation mark at the beginning of the phrase about the dollars in gold and silver. And what she realized was, you know, if there's a quotation mark at the beginning, not only is there probably one at the end, but there's also probably a citation. And in fact, she clicked through and found the source of this piece of information. So sometimes, again, looking at the whole page and looking for really small details can do a great deal in helping students work through what they need and what they're looking for. And then, of course, if you've been with me before, if you've been with me before, you've heard me talk about finding proper vocabulary. So again, here is a typical kind of search I'd see from a student who had an idea of a concept that they wanted to look into, a scholarly concept. And one of the things I talked about in an earlier webinar is that when you look at this page, the results for immigrants sending money home, there's actually a word that appears multiple times throughout the search results. And if you are familiar with sociology, you know for a fact that remittances is in fact a very good search term, is actually a scholarly term for money that immigrants send to their home country from work they're doing. And but what we find is when students look at a page, or when users look at a page of results, they tend to skip words they don't know. So another thing to teach students is when you do a search, look for words that appear in the text. Always check the word with doing a define search to get a dictionary, and you can click through here to get more dictionary results. But then, when you find the new, when you find the proper term, you can leverage that into a much better search. And I see one of you is asking if there's an easier way to quickly differentiate scholarly and official sites and not listing all the personal sites. And the question lists breeds of cats as an example. And I would say from that, it's really about leveraging, it's again about thinking about vocabulary. So if we go back to, to immigrants send money home, and the New York Times, in fact, is a fairly authoritative site, right? But when I look at, and the results for this are getting better and better. I must have done this search an awful lot of times. But when I do this, especially I used to get a lot of newspaper articles, and some, I see immigration support and things like that. And so as I look at the results, and as I, in fact, click through and actually read the articles, which is, of course, more important than reading the results, if I become aware of this term remittances, and then I fold it into my search, once I've gone to more official language, I tend to get more official results. It's not hard and fast. But once I figure out the same thing when I had breeds of cats as an example, and then I changed it to recognized breeds of cats, immediately that term recognized brings in, well, all the agencies that do the recognizing. So when you can find the terms of art and fold them into your searches, that is a good, easy, kind of fast and dirty, but highly effective and impactful way to get more official results. I wanted to introduce to you something that has just been released in the last couple days called Verbatim Search. So one thing that I know that folks wonder about is that they know that Google is bringing up synonyms, that Google's doing spell checking, and in fact there's been talk about Google's personalization, and I will actually provide on the CSU webinar archive page, there will be links for you, and one of them to resources, and one of them I'll provide an article that talks about how we personalize and what impact that has on your search. But let's say you want to know what your search looks like if you turn all that off. Well, now there's a way to do that, which is very exciting. It just started a few days ago, and it's in the left-hand panel, which I absolutely love. Again, if you've heard me talking before, it's where I think everything wonderful resides. So here is the left-hand panel. It's that left-hand column of your screen. And if you scroll down, you'll see there's this link, More Search Tools. So when I click on More Search Tools, it opens up and gives me a bunch of really amazing tools. And among them now is this Verbatim. So if I click on Verbatim, it turns off spell check. It turns off personalization. And it turns off synonymizing. So you'll see that now there's this blue stripe across the top of the page that's telling me I'm in Verbatim. If I want to leave it later, I click on that little blue X on the right-hand side. But now all of my results are unpersonalized, no synonyms. They still offer, I still get a chance in case I had a misspelling. Here, in this case, I just wanted the plural of crisis, and I didn't want the singular. But this turns off any kind of enhancements that you naturally get to your results. So you can actually do this and see what unenhanced results look like. So if you're doing a search and you're worried that some kind of personalization is having an impact, you can check out in verbatim mode. On the other hand, something that I've also shown before, but sorry, not debt crisis, but made me really happy is I wanted to show you that we actually synonymize fairly widely. So here, where I do a search for death tax, which in the past I would have argued is really likely to bring back documents from one particular point of view and not give you a broad view. And I was very pleased to find that we synonymize it with estate tax. And also with inheritance tax, I found. So that when you do a search, even for a term that would tend to bring back a skewed result, it is entirely possible that you're getting a broader picture in any event. Okay, so that's verbatim search. Here's something that has nothing directly to do with search, but which I noted with my students that I wanted to talk to you about. The first summer that I was teaching search, these many years ago, I was doing summer camps. And my first summer, I taught 50 students over the course of the summer in summer camps. And I just discovered hoax sites, and I thought they were wonderful. And this tree octopus site about an octopus that lives in a tree is an excellent example of a hoax site, because if you had a checklist that said, here's what a reliable site looks like, it pretty much meets everything on the checklist. That's why I'm not a fan of checklists. But I would, back then I would give this to students along with a lot of true sites about octopi. And really the purpose of the experiment, of the exercise, was to have students thinking proactively about what kinds of sites they found useful, what kinds of layouts and what types of information and what reading level worked for them, and what triggers they looked for in a site that made them happy, a source that made them happy. In any event, I showed everyone this tree octopus site, and because of the way the exercise went, I pretty much got to be standing behind each kid as they got to this exercise. And I'll tell you the strangest thing I noticed, and that was that every single student of the 50 looked at the page and said, that's weird. And then they went on to either believe it or not. They were about 50-50 split on whether they determined it was a legitimate site or an illegitimate site. But every single one said, that's weird, which was really funny because I realized that we actually do process verbally. That when we look at pages, we tend to say things out loud, and saying that's weird doesn't mean a site is false, because another place kids say that's weird is when I show them the Yeti crab, which some of you have seen before, and the Yeti crab is real. It's weird and true. But I've learned that actually listening to your own verbalizations as you search is a great cue for when you might want to dig a bit deeper. And in fact, one day I saw something online and I said, that's weird. And I was like, wait a second, I told my students they should listen to that. And I followed it up and had a fascinating chain of investigation on the topic I was looking at the time. So it's a funny little thing, but you can teach your students that. Also, it's good to think about web terminology. For example, words like about, official, and I have to say conspiracy are excellent terms to talk to students about and make sure they're aware of. Teaching students to use Control F or Command F, which is the find feature that you can use in your browser. It allows you to find a word on a page. In this graphic here, I did so to find out about Dan Russell and his search and research blog. As we know, the About Us page is where we find out who wrote the page. And it's not always available, but it's a very powerful word. It's a very, very powerful word when combined with a find tool. It's good to know what an official website is about, and knowing the word conspiracy and thinking about the word conspiracy helps students think through the types of sources they're seeing on the web. Now, I want to talk to you about, this is an excellent example, a real-world example that you can give students to read about. I have the post for this blog entry here, but I don't know how many of you remember seeing this Martin Luther King quote. It appeared the night that Osama bin Laden died. I actually had Twitter open. I'll always remember it as the first piece of world news I learned about via Twitter. I saw it pop up, and shortly thereafter, I saw this Martin Luther King quote pop up. And I remember seeing that and thinking, that is an absolutely beautiful sentiment. That's really interesting. And over the course of the next day or two, I saw this Martin Luther King quote again and again and again and again. I'm ashamed to say that I didn't really think that much about it. But this particular blogger thought, that's really odd. I wonder when Martin Luther King would have said that. Which enemy would he have been speaking about? And she actually went on an investigation, which she outlines in her blog, and discovered that someone had given a Martin Luther King quote, had written this before the quote. So she'd written herself, I mourn the loss of thousands of precious lives, etc., on Facebook, and then put a Martin Luther King quote. Somewhere along the line, someone had taken out the quotation marks and retweeted and reshared on Facebook, and this became a Martin Luther King quote. And in fact, yesterday I did a search in Twitter, and there were 3 or 4 people who reposted this quote just yesterday as a legitimate Martin Luther King quote. So this blog outlines it's a great one for your students to look at because they too may remember having seen this quote and having seen it attributed to Martin Luther King. And you can look at the blog together and talk backwards about how this particular journalist tracked it back. And in fact, you can maybe even have them go through that process themselves. Now, what I absolutely loved was this PC World journalist also saw the post on Twitter and thought, that's weird. And he thought it didn't sound like a Martin Luther King quote either. And he had a really creative, really simple workaround back to the left-hand panel and actually speaking to your question about the time and the date range. So the quote was Martin Luther King. We're going to see if this pulls it up. Okay, so what he actually did was he went into this left-hand panel again and used the time feature. He specifically used the, whoops, I didn't circle that very well, the custom date range feature. And what you can actually do is you can enter dates here from and to, but I can look up until, let's say, the 1st of April 2011 and run a search. And he said there are some messy results, but basically if you work through it, what you discover is the quote didn't exist prior to April 1st of 2011. So if it was a Martin Luther King quote, but it didn't exist prior to that time, how could it possibly be a true quote? So that was a quick, down and dirty, I thought incredibly clever way of testing the veracity and the authenticity of a quote. So I see, sorry, the question I see asked here is sometimes when you do a search, these options here show up and sometimes they don't. Yes, when you run a search in Google, we actually, in the bottom of the panel here, we show you the ones that we think are most likely that you will want to use. And so at this point, this is what it will often look like, something like this, where you won't see all the choices, but there's a More Search Tools link, and if you click on it, then options pop up. So are there any other questions? I'm going to let you enter them. I'm going to keep going. If you have questions, do. So with stepping stone resources, stepping stone resources are another strategy I talk to students about. And I've mentioned them briefly here when we, for example, did a search for immigrants send money home and found the word remittances. That's one example. It's the opportunity to It's the opportunity to find information and leverage it to get new information. So one of the things that happens is that students are told all kinds of sites they can't use, that they're really tempted to use. And for me, I find that it's not really productive to say, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. Because as I say, they go out in the world and they see people doing that. And they say, well, if everyone else is doing it, why can't I? So I strongly prefer, instead of saying, don't do this, to talk about how different resources are useful. I'm not a fan, personally, broadly speaking, of Q&A sites. However, if you check your facts, Q&A sites can provide vocabulary, as we've talked about, for better, that students can leverage to create better searches. And now, here's an example. I was very surprised to read in Wikipedia that Tolstoy and Gandhi had a correspondence. Now, I have to tell you that I never even thought of Tolstoy and Gandhi as being contemporaries, which may be short-sighted of me, but I don't kind of think about them in the same breath, I guess you could say. When I read this here, I thought, oh, they had a correspondence. I thought, how do I learn more about that, right? The instinct I want is, ooh, this is here. How do I confirm it? How do I see it's true? And what I actually did was I went to Google Books, and I did a search. For Tolstoy, I can't spell, but for Tolstoy and Gandhian correspondence, and I clicked right into it here. And now I'm able to be reading the correspondence itself. So it's one thing to see it in Wikipedia. It's one thing to be told, don't use Wikipedia. It's another thing to be told, you know, when you use Wikipedia, it's great for triggering inquiry. It's great for giving you ideas of what you can look for, and actually modeling for students how you go from Wikipedia and move to a new and different type of resource that might be more authoritative. So some quick common misconceptions. One thing that we found in the course of our credibility classes that surprised us is that some people think that the appearance of a Google custom search box or Google served ads on a website means that they've been vetted as being high quality. In particular, there's one of the pages we used to use in our exercises was about how the pineal gland is a third eye and can see into the future. And educators would look at that page and would say, well, that doesn't mesh with my sense of credibility. And they'd get to the bottom and they'd see a custom search and they'd say, oh, maybe I was wrong. And we asked them, what do you mean maybe you were wrong? And they said, well, look, they've got a Google search. So you should know that web pages that have custom search engines or ads in no cases indicate from any company, indicate that that company has really put their seal of approval on that website. It means that the website and the company have entered into a business transaction. So that's something important to know. Also, how well ads match the content of a web page just indicates that the person who set up the web page picked an advertising service with a good algorithm. So it's not necessarily appropriate to teach students that a page with ads that are on different topic than the content of the page means that it's a bad ad. On the other hand, I have had young students click through to pages with inappropriate-looking advertisements on an appropriate content page, and I teach students then not to go exploring that website further because it's entirely possible that they'll be unhappy with what they encounter, or at least I'll be unhappy with what they encounter. And I see one of you asked about a Google custom search engine. Custom search engines are one way. It's at google.com/CSE. They are one way that you can set up for students a pre-selected set of sources, and they can use Google search. That didn't come out thoroughly. There we go. They can use Google search tools then to navigate among the sites that you've pre-selected. Sorry. Another quick thing, you should know that just because something's an .edu or a .org doesn't mean it's necessarily better quality. I know plenty of students from one of my graduate schools who felt frustrated they got low grades on a paper and posted it to their personal part of the university site to show the world. And so you just need to be aware of where you are on a university site, and remember that organizations, in point of fact, may also have an agenda, may also do a good or a bad job. And if you go to any kind of vendor like GoDaddy.com and look, you'll see you can set up a .org. And in fact, one of the really popular hoax sites is dihydrogenmonoxide.org, which is all about how water is a lethal chemical that should be outlawed. And it's a .org, and it's a hoax site. So, and there are lots of good .coms out there. Again, what's good and what's bad? Remember that first of all, we have a lot of new types of sources out there, and we need to not be defining for students by type of source. There are good blogs and there are bad blogs. There are good wikis and there are bad wikis. There are appropriate ways to use wikis. There are appropriate ways to use blogs. And there are times when using scholarly sources isn't necessarily the best for a particular information need. So think about what your question is, what your need is, and then be ready to make a good judgment about what type of source will work. So unfortunately, I didn't think this was timing out quite right. So there are technical tools that you can use. And again, I'm going to share this with you, and you can go and explore them. I'll spend 2 minutes just giving you a quick view of some of these tools. So Alexa.com is a website that you can go to for getting information. Let's see what details they have about census.gov. They give information about how much traffic the sites get, especially from the United States, how many sites link to it, and you can kind of delve deeply into who's using the sites. You can look at contact information to find out maybe who owns the site potentially. And who some of the audience is, things like that. That can give you a view into a site. Another thing you can do is you can use the link operator. This is my silly little blog that was very short-lived before I came to Google, so it doesn't have a lot of links, which is okay. As I said, short-lived. But link : operator and then the web address, all as one word. And this is not a comprehensive list, I'm pleased to say, but this shows you who's linking. So, for example, there are some white power sites that are popular to use when talking about authority, and it's often you do a link : search to those sites and see who's linking to it, and that helps understand if a lot of white power organizations are linking to it. It tells you something about who the site is. And if we keep linking to it, then it shows a lot of educational sites do as well. Search metrics is, and you have the link for this you will have in the deck, is this linkvendor.com, and it allows you to see some of the outbound links, analyze the outbound links from a website. And finally, you can use Internic, and again, you'll have this link in the presentation. You can use Internic to do a search. Here I searched for, actually it was my consulting company from the past, to the point research who owns it, and you can get information. Here it's just owned by the company itself, but you can track back and see ownership of a site. So those are tools that are available, and it's great to know about them. I think that we really should only anticipate that any of us are going to use them when we have something we're really wondering about and really digging into. So there are some screenshots that you'll be able to look at. And finally, when you come back and look at this deck, and this is fairly text-heavy, so you can look it over yourselves, there are some ways for looking for plagiarism. And the idea that common and uncommon phrases. If you search for uncommon phrases that you see in your students' papers, then you will find them online. you'll find them online. I also like searching for uncommon phrases because it tells me if someone's pulled just from, if a website that I'm looking at that looks good to me has just pulled their content from Wikipedia. And finally, we have a couple of lesson ideas that you can look over. And you can find more on our website. So sorry, I kind of flew through that last portion, but I wonder if you have any questions. So if you have any questions, please go ahead and enter them into chat. And while I'm waiting, I will pull up a Google customized search engine page for you to look at. So this is a Google custom search engine, and or the page where you can go to create one. And there you have a number of options, but you can basically pull in, if you have 50 websites you really like, you can just dump them in one place, and your students can search within that realm of websites. And then there are various ways you can tweak it for what you want them to see. Where will the slideshow be archived? Excellent question. So this is, and I'll send you this link. So actually, right at the end of this presentation, you should get an email, and it should have a link to our team website. And in fact, it should, sorry, your CSU, not CSE. It should link you directly to this page, the CSU webinar series. And this is where I've been archiving the webinars so far. I haven't gotten up the recording notes or timeline for the last one, but for each one, I'll give you the webinar recording, a timeline, which means like what was covered around what minute, so you can go right into the recording and zoom to the part you want to see. And then there will be slides, there will be notes, which allow you to kind of, if you want to just skim through and choose where you want to go in the presentation. And then I'm actually going to provide you with a bunch of links. So I hope that you will come and visit the site, because there's going to be a lot of, this was a huge topic for a short time, and so there will be a lot of supporting information there. And yes, you will see crap in there. Sorry, forgive the language, but there's the crap test. Yes, acronyms are one way to do it. Actually, I've been seeing a lot of convergence around just the idea of who, when, why. Each of those kind of big questions in a small word, but who, when, why as an easy way to think about assessment. I see another question that the timeline tool went away. Yes, the timeline tool did go away. But luckily, we've added other things like Verbatim to the left-hand panel, and I hope you'll explore those as well. I know we're over time. Do you have any other questions? All right, then. Thank you so much. If you have further questions, you can always reach me at tbm@google.com. Thank you so much for your time, and have an absolutely lovely